Welcome everybody. In this video we're going to be covering authorization in an ASP.NET Core application. Specifically, we'll be taking a look at version .NET 7. In terms of authorization, not much has changed. The main difference is that long time ago there was a concept of roles that we now discard. So if you ever had a question, what's the difference between roles and claims? That role that you knew and loved, that's just a claim now, okay? Here I have an example of an application with authentication setup. So we've added authentication with cookie authentication. We're using the use authentication middleware, and we have two endpoints. One for logging in, where I am creating my claims principal with my claim. I'm signing in, and then I have another endpoint where I am just checking the claim. I have the application running, and if I navigate to unsecure, because I don't have any cookies in my application, I just get an empty because find user returns null, so I get the empty value here on the end. Being able to authenticate with an application means that the application can identify you. It's the same as going to the government, receiving a passport, and now you're authenticated with the government. We just know who you are. Authorization answers a different question, whether you're allowed or not. If I have a European passport, that gives me access to most countries, so I'm authorized to visit them, and that's just because the claim that I will have is something along the lines of passport type EU. Otherwise, if I have a Latvian passport that says I'm alien, the only passport that does it, I can't go anywhere. I will need a visa. With the addition of this passport type and maybe putting a EUR on the end, basically signifying that this is a European passport type, I now want to authorize some endpoints. Let's take over here. We will put Sweden and we'll check. If context user has claim, we'll place passport type in there and EUR will return allowed. Otherwise, if you're not allowed to abide by the HTTP standard, we'll take the context, we will go to the response, we'll take the status code, and we're gonna set it to a 403. 403 status code means you're not authorized, you're not allowed. If you set 401, that means you're not authenticated. If we want to handle both of these status codes here, this is what it will look like. If context user navigate to identities, and we should have an identity where the authentication type referring to the authentication schema means auth schema. If we don't have any of that, the response type is 401 and we just return an empty string. Format this, and then if we don't have a European passport to access Sweden, we are doing a 403 and then we're returning a not allowed. And finally, if we pass both of those checks, we are allowed. Let's come back to the browser and try to visit Sweden, and we have a 401. That's because we're not authenticated. If for now, I'll come down here and I'll strip out the setting of the passport type, meaning that I'm not gonna have this claim, I should be unauthorized to visit it. Let's visit the login endpoint. I'm now going to have a cookie. And if I now try to visit Sweden, I'm gonna get a 403 status code, which means I'm not authorized. If I come back around here and comment the claim, come back to the browser, I'll clear this cookie, I'll re-log in, there I go, and again, try to go to Sweden, now I'm allowed. That is all that authorization is. It's a combination of first being authenticated, because if we don't know who you are, how can we even begin to say, are you allowed? The first step to being authorized to do something is being authenticated with the expected schema. This first step might be all you're looking for. If you have a user and he logged in, he doesn't need any special claims. He can just start using your website. If then you have manager or admin panels or God knows what, then you're adding additional claims onto users, and then you're checking those claims on specific endpoints. This is an additional optional step for elevated privileges or some kind of customized privileges. This is where you're checking claims, checking the contents of the claims principal, this user record. Now, what may happen is, let's say we will take this endpoint, and we will also put Norway here, Norway, and Denmark. Hypothetically speaking, just to spice up this scenario so we can again re-arrive at the solution that Microsoft is giving us, we're going to say, we're still looking for the default authentication scheme that you got here. However, we don't want a European passport. We specifically want a Norwegian passport. I don't know the letters for Norway, so I'll just say NOR. And unless you're Norwegian, we don't allow you here, okay? Norway in my story are pretty selfish guys. And then in Denmark, the rule for having a European passport still applies. However, we'll go to the top here and we'll say we want a slightly different person to say who you are. For this, we'll add another cookie authentication schema. We'll remove this here and place authentication schema 2 here. We'll grab authentication schema 2 here, place it where the Denmark is, and here we can add an additional parameter to switch it on or off, so we can authenticate either as authentication 1 or as authentication 2. That doesn't matter in this example. What I'm trying to illustrate is that you can have many endpoints, and then you can have many different combinations of who do you want to authenticate as to reach this endpoint, and then what are your claims requirements. You should be able to mix and match these as you're building up your endpoints, and you certainly do not want to repeat this logic over and over again. This is where we are going to be smart about it, and we're going to do the same thing that we've done before. We're going to go to our application. We are going to create our own authorization middleware, where we're going to have the context, and again we will have the next delegate. We'll call next over here. I'll go as far as returning it, then placing a semicolon here. I am not going to build up an example for authentication 2, because what it requires is a bunch of services and a bunch of reflections. So let's just say that I can create a service that will understand if this point requires authentication schema 2. It's going to look something like this. Auth scheme, and then I'll just place auth schema 2. And then through reflection at my application startup, I will be able to figure out when I'm hitting this Denmark endpoint, does it have this authentication schema on it? And if it does, and the current user isn't authentication schema 2, I'm going to go ahead and return a 401. I'll place a comment over here because this is not real code, this is just pseudocode. I will mainly focus on authentication schema, the regular one, and not put in a layer, the abstraction layer that can do multiple authentication schemas. Microsoft has already done the hard work for us. Just understand that if I would be rebuilding it, it would involve a lot of reflection. So we're just going to focus on authentication schema. Let's grab this code, we'll copy it and place it over here. And that's not my middleware, that is actually just the unsecure endpoint. I wanted to place it over there. Cool, want to delete one too many braces. I do not want to return a string here, I want a completed task. So if we're not authenticated with the default schema, again, imagine some kind of service that we're extracting here where we can check what kind of schema this requires. And then we will do the same thing here. And again, here I am checking a specific claim. Imagine if I could place some kind of attribute auth claim and then say you need a passport type Euro, okay? Again, I use a reflection, I check what does Denmark need, and at that point I can surface these values in this middleware, check, and then return the appropriate response, okay? Let's return a task completed here. For now, we are just going to default to the example of having or not having a European passport. I'm going to come down and I will just comment out the rest of this stuff because we now have an idea that all of this stuff can be configured as services and surfaced in our middleware. Let's comment out this non-existent attribute. We'll comment this out. And to begin with, let's get rid of the claim as well. We'll come back to the browser, wipe the cookie. And before we try to re-log in, let's try to reach Sweden because by default, we are going to require that you're authenticated as part of the authorization process. Let's reach it and we get a 401. And this 401 is triggered from over here. Coming back around, let's try to log in. And this is where we're not allowed. Again, coming back around, if I wanted the login endpoint to circumvent authorization, I would do something like allow anonymous. Again, this would be an additional attribute. For now, what I can do is say if the context request path, we'll say starts with segment, and I think I can just say login over here. We'll just return next and skip any authorization. Again, reiterating, this could be an additional service that checks for allow anonymous. Coming back to the browser, let's reach login again. The path value needs to start with a slash, so that's a really good hint. Let's do that. We'll try to re-log in. We're now logged in and we have removed the passport type Euro. Let's go and try to reach Sweden. We have a 403. Let's come back, add back in the claim. And please do notice that if you have some kind of database with claims and in your database you make a change of, I have this user, I want to give him a new claim, it's not going to magically change the cookie in his browser. The user will have to go through a process where he or she relogs in and obtains a new cookie with a new claim. Otherwise, you need some kind of logic that is going to go and fetch and always re-enrich the user session with the claims in your database. Let's come back and check this out. Let's re-log in with a new cookie. Let's go to Sweden. And here we are. Coming back to our application, here we have all of these various moving parts. How did Microsoft choose to take these parts, condense them, and give them to you as a comfortable to use tool? The middleware, same as in the previous example, they've just gone ahead and give you use authorization. The authorization middleware is going to do the same thing that it does here. However, it is also going to do the things that I talked about. If you're going to mark up your endpoints with some kind of schemas, requirements, which are policies, the services in the authorization middleware are going to check that, and we're actually going to look at it. The rules which you are checking if the person is authorized at specific endpoints look like this. You go to Builder, Services, and Add Authentication. This is your configuration layer where you can define rules for building up policies. A policy describes what a user should look like to reach an endpoint. And by the way, Add Authentication, in the Use Authorization middleware, if I will open it up, we have a Verify Services Registered function. This function is going to try to get a service of Authorization Policy Marker service, just a class that gets registered to make sure that you have called Add Authorization over here, and that says Add Authentication. Let's make that say Add Authorization. In here, when we add Authorization Policy Evaluator, we will also see this Authorization Policy Marker service. Authorization middleware will crash if you have not registered these services. In order to configure these rules, you have to specify policies, and policies go into the authorization builder. So let's say that this is a builder, and inside this builder, we can add a policy. You can give a policy a name, let's say EU passport, and then we will have a policy builder, so PB. The policy builder implements a Fluent API and exposes a bunch of functions to you which allow you to build up the rules which you want for this policy. Let's check it out. What is our rule for this passport type? We're looking for this authentication schema. So let's say require authenticated user, add authentication schemas. That will be our authentication schema. And then we're also going to require a claim. Which claim? That claim is going to be passport type user. Place this over here. And there we have it. A EU passport policy, then which we can choose to apply to any endpoint. The way that we do it is we say require authorization and then just provide a string over here. Okay. If you're using controllers and MVC, this will be the authorize attribute for you, where you will be able to specify your policy and set it something like this. All right. But this is if you're using controllers. Then finally, if I want to make sure that my login endpoint can always be reached by unauthenticated users, I can say allow anonymous. Let's come back around to the top just so we're looking at these two components. Come back to the browser and try to reach Sweden, and we can. If we come back to the policy and we say that we want a passport type with a value of EUR, not a real thing, but refreshing it, we're still capable of reaching Sweden, and that's because I placed it on the unsecure endpoint. Let's take this require authorization, place it over here, come back to the browser and refresh this time. And we're getting a 404. The reason for that is we are getting redirected. So if again we go to the network tab and we refresh, we go to Sweden, we are gonna see Sweden at 302 to redirect, and this is the location that it redirects us to. So there is redirect logic built in into the authorization middleware. Let's come back around to the application and look inside the authorization middleware together. Open up user authorization. We'll then go to use middleware registration, authorization middleware. Open that up. And here's the file that we have. I'll close my Explorer. And first of all, we get the next delegate, which is injected. So we can actually call the next endpoint. And we have the policy providers. The policies that you're building up can be surfaced through this service. When this middleware gets invoked, we get the endpoint, and then it attempts to extract some authorized data. All this authorization data means, and what this is actually doing, is the reflection bit that I was talking about. It is going to take a look at this endpoint and it's going to check, does it have an authorized attribute? Does it require authorization? What kind of policy is assigned to it? All that kind of stuff. It will pick up the data that is registered on the endpoint. It will then take your policy provider, all of the policies that you have registered. It's going to take the endpoint, it's going to smack them together, and by the end you're going to end up with a policy that should be ran against this endpoint. In our case, if it's the Sweden endpoint, we're going to end up with the logic for this policy over here. Coming back to the authorization middleware, if we haven't found a policy, that means we can just run the next delegate and return. So we're bypassing any kind of authorization. We then go through an authentication check. It's not the same as being authenticated. Imagine you have a cookie for one authentication schema, you actually get authenticated with it, and then the policy is asking for a different authentication schema, so it checks if you're actually authenticated with the correct session. That's what's happening here, and after we make that check, we just verify that if the endpoint that we're trying to reach has an allow anonymous attribute. If it does, just go ahead and pass through and then circumvent any kind of authorization checking. And then finally, you have the policy evaluator. We will try to authorize the policy against the authenticated user. We will get some kind of result, and then we're going to get a authorization middleware result handler, and that will know how to take this result and map it to a response, be it a 401, a 403. The reason this layer exists is, let's say you have failed authorization, but then you can override this service and instead of returning a 403, do some kind of custom stuff. And that's the kind of power that dependency injection will open up for you if you take the steps to actually open up these services and take a look at them. That is pretty much all you have for your authorization layer. One last thing that you should note is require claim and add authentication schemas. These things are written at compile time. What if you have more asynchronous operations, communication with a database, cache, whatever? You have some kind of custom flow for your authorization process. You need to communicate with some kind of components. Don't worry, Microsoft has you covered. For this, you need to implement custom requirements. All you do is add requirements. This function accepts iAuthorizations requirement, which is just a marker service. Marker services, same as you've seen in the use authorization. A marker service is just something that marks something so your application can look it up, load it, etc., use it for some kind of setup. In this case, we are marking a class which is going to parameterize your authentication handler. Let's come down here. We'll create our class, which will be my requirement. This is an iAuthorizations requirement. And this can contain a constructor. This can contain properties. You can put stuff in here when you create this, but I'm going to leave this empty. you can then have a handler, my requirement handler, which implements an authorization handler of my requirement. And then here we have to implement a missing member. I'll add a couple of spaces so we're actually looking at the middle of the screen. And in this context, you can reach the user to do whatever you want. And if you need to say that it has failed or succeeded, on the context you have fail and succeed methods, where in succeed you pass in your my requirement and whatnot. And finally, you need to return your completed task. And in the constructor, any services that you register with the dependency injection container, you can also put them here. So now you can communicate with the database, with the cache, whatever you want. You can inject services. Any kind of authorization logic that you desire can be placed here, and it will be invoked as part of a policy that can then be applied to any endpoint. Keeping in mind that it will trigger as part of the use authorization middleware. So any middleware, any endpoints that are past use authorization aren't going to be triggered if you fail authorization. This will be it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget, if you enjoyed it, leave a like, subscribe. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. If you want to say thank you, leave it in the comments as well. Or better yet, come support me on Patreon. Big thank you to all of my patrons that are already supporting me. Your help is very much appreciated. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day.